In 1945, a Nazi submarine surfaced in Argentina 2 months after Germany surrendered, carrying cargo that has never been fully explained and passengers who vanished into thin air before anyone could question them about what they were really doing on the other side of the world. But that's not even the creepiest mystery we're covering today. Stick around until number 1, where we'll talk about an entire village that helped hide one of history's most wanted men and the disturbing reason why they might have done it. Number 5, the Lady Be Good. On April 4, 1943, a United States Army Air Force's B-24 Liberator bomber took off from Salak Airfield in Libya on a mission to bomb the harbor in Naples, Italy. The bomber was named Lady Be Good, and it was on only its second combat mission. The crew consisted of 9 men: pilot William Hatton, co-pilot Robert Toner, navigator D.P. Hayes, bombardier John Waravka, and 5 other crew members. The mission to Naples was supposed to be straightforward, but when the bomber group arrived at the target, the area was covered in heavy clouds and dust, making it impossible to see the harbor. Most of the bombers in the group turned back, but a few, including the Lady Be Good, continued on, trying to find a break in the clouds. They never found one, so they turned back toward their base in Libya. As the Lady Be Good made its way back to base, the crew radioed that they were returning and asked for a bearing to help them navigate home. They were given a radio bearing, but for reasons that are still unclear, the crew never made it back to base. When the sun came up the next morning and the Lady Be Good hadn't returned, the plane was listed as missing in action. The military assumed that the bomber had crashed into the Mediterranean Sea, and after a brief search, the crew was presumed dead. But the Lady Be Good didn't crash into the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, it didn't crash anywhere near the coast. On November 9, 1958, more than 15 years after the plane went missing, a British oil exploration team was flying over the Libyan desert when they spotted something strange in the sand. It was an aircraft sitting upright in the middle of the Sahara Desert, about 440 miles inland from the coast. The plane was the Lady Be Good, and it was in remarkable condition. The landing gear was still up, the guns were still loaded, and there was still water in the water bottles inside the plane. The radio still worked, and when investigators tried to start the engines, some of them actually turned over. The plane looked like it had just landed in the desert the day before, but there was one major problem. There were no bodies inside the plane, and no sign of the crew anywhere near the wreckage. Investigators were baffled. How did a plane that was supposed to be returning to a coastal airbase end up hundreds of miles inland in the desert? And where was the crew? The investigation into what happened to the Lady Be Good and its crew took years to piece together, but eventually, investigators were able to figure out what most likely happened on that night in April 1943. When the Lady Be Good was returning from its mission, the crew radioed for a bearing to help them navigate home. They were told they were on course, but what the crew didn't realize was that they had already passed over their airbase without seeing it because of the poor visibility and the lack of ground lights due to wartime blackout conditions. The crew thought they were still over the Mediterranean Sea flying toward the coast, but in reality they were flying south deeper into the Sahara Desert. The plane had enough fuel to fly for several more hours, so the crew just kept flying south, thinking they were heading toward safety. Eventually, the plane ran out of fuel, and the crew realized they were lost. They bailed out of the plane, and the Lady Be Good glided on autopilot for a few more miles before crash landing in the desert relatively intact. After the crew parachuted out of the plane, they found themselves in the middle of the Sahara Desert with no water and no idea where they were. They tried to walk north toward what they thought was the coast, but they were actually walking deeper into the desert. Over the next several days and weeks, search teams eventually found the remains of 8 of the 9 crew members scattered across the desert. The farthest body was found about 109 miles from where the plane crashed. One crew member was never found. One of the crew members, Robert Toner, kept a diary during the ordeal, and his diary was found with his body. The entries are heartbreaking. He wrote about how thirsty they were, how they tried to ration their water, and how they kept walking hoping to find help. The last entry in his diary was written 8 days after they bailed out of the plane. It simply said, "No help, yet very cold night." The Lady Be Good mystery isn't really about what happened to the plane. Investigators figured that out. The mystery is why the crew flew so far off course. Some people think that the radio bearing they were given was wrong. Others think that the crew simply made a navigational error. But the most disturbing theory is that the crew was so disoriented and exhausted from their mission that they didn't realize they had flown over their base, and by the time they realized something was wrong, it was too late. They were already hundreds of miles into the desert with no way to get back. The Lady Be Good sat in the desert for 15 years before anyone found it, and by then the crew had been dead for over a decade, their bodies mummified by the dry desert heat. The plane was eventually salvaged for parts, and the crew was given a proper burial, but the question remains: how did 9 experienced airmen fly hundreds of miles in the wrong direction without realizing it, and could it have been prevented? Number 4. The Amber Room. The Amber Room was one of the most beautiful and valuable pieces of art ever created. It was an entire room made out of amber, panels backed with gold leaf and mirrors, and it was decorated with precious stones. The room was originally constructed in Prussia in the early 1700s, and it was given to Russian Tsar Peter the Great as a gift in 1716. The Amber Room was installed in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, Russia, and it became one of the most prized possessions of the Russian royal family. The room was expanded and renovated over the years, and by the 20th century, it was considered one of the wonders of the world. But when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Amber Room became a target. Adolf Hitler was obsessed with collecting art, and he wanted the Amber Room for his planned Führer Museum, a massive museum that was supposed to house the greatest art collection in the world. When German forces advanced toward Leningrad, now St. Petersburg Soviet curators tried to dismantle the Amber Room and evacuate it to safety, but the amber panels were extremely fragile, and they started to crumble when workers tried to remove them. So the curators decided to hide the room instead. They covered the amber panels with wallpaper, hoping the Germans wouldn't notice. But the Germans knew exactly what they were looking for. In October 1941, German soldiers entered the Catherine Palace, and within 36 hours they had carefully dismantled the Amber Room, packed it into 27 crates, and shipped it to Königsberg in East Prussia, now Kaliningrad, Russia. The room was reassembled in Königsberg Castle and put on display for German officers and Nazi officials to admire. But by 1944, the tide of the war had turned, and the Soviet Red Army was advancing toward Königsberg. The director of the Königsberg Castle Museum was ordered to dismantle the Amber Room again and hide it before the Soviets arrived. In January 1945, the Amber Room was taken apart and packed into crates. But what happened next is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of World War II. Some witnesses said the crates were stored in the castle's basement. Others said they were loaded onto a ship or a train. But when Soviet forces captured Königsberg in April 1945, the Amber Room was gone. The castle was heavily damaged during the battle, and it was later demolished by the Soviets in 1968, but no trace of the Amber Room was ever found. After the war, the Soviet government launched a massive investigation to find the Amber Room. They interviewed witnesses, searched buildings, and even excavated sites where the crates might have been hidden, but they found nothing. Over the years, there have been countless theories about what happened to the Amber Room. Some people think it was destroyed during the bombing of Königsberg. Others think it was loaded onto a ship that was sunk by Soviet submarines. There's also a theory that the crates were hidden in a secret underground bunker or a mine shaft somewhere in Germany or Poland. One of the most popular theories is that the Amber Room was hidden in a network of tunnels beneath Königsberg Castle, and that it's still there waiting to be discovered. But despite numerous excavations and searches, nothing has ever been found. Another theory is that the Amber Room was smuggled out of Germany by high-ranking Nazi officials who were trying to preserve it for after the war. Some people think it ended up in South America or even the United States, but again, there's no evidence to support this. In 1997, German police raided the office of a lawyer in Bremen and found a small mosaic panel that had been part of the Amber Room. The lawyer's father had been a German soldier during the war, and he had apparently taken the panel as a souvenir. This discovery proved that at least some pieces of the Amber Room survived the war, but it didn't answer the bigger question of where the rest of it went. In 2003, the Russian government completed a reconstruction of the Amber Room using old photographs and documents as a guide. The new Amber Room was installed in the Catherine Palace, and it's now a major tourist attraction, but the original Amber Room is still missing, and its location remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of World War II. Some historians think the room was destroyed, and that we'll never find it, but others believe it's still out there, hidden in some forgotten bunker or basement, waiting to be rediscovered. The search for the Amber Room continues to this day, and every few years, someone claims to have found a new lead, but so far, none of these leads have panned out. The Amber Room is worth an estimated $500 million today, but its historical and cultural value is priceless. Whether it still exists or was destroyed decades ago may never be known. Number 3. The Ghost Convoy of the Ardennes. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Germany launched a massive surprise offensive against Allied forces in the Ardennes Forest. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the war, and it caught the Allies completely off guard. But in the chaos of the battle, there was one incident that has never been fully explained, and it's become known as the Ghost Convoy of the Ardennes. On the night of December 18, 1944, a convoy of American trucks was traveling through the Ardennes Forest, carrying supplies and ammunition to the front lines. The convoy consisted of about 30 trucks, and it was escorted by a small group of soldiers. The convoy was traveling along a narrow road through dense forest, and visibility was poor because of heavy snow and fog. At around 10 p.m., the convoy stopped at a crossroads to check their maps and figure out which direction to go. The lead driver got out of his truck and walked back to talk to the other drivers. But when he got to the back of the convoy, he realized that half of the trucks were missing. He walked back up the road to see if they had fallen behind, but there was no sign of them. The road behind the convoy was empty. The driver and the other soldiers were confused because they hadn't heard any explosions or gunfire, and there were no signs of an ambush. The trucks had simply vanished. The remaining trucks continued on to their destination, and when they arrived, the commanding officer was informed that half of the convoy was missing. A search party was sent out the next morning to look for the missing trucks, but they found nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no tire tracks, nothing. It was as if the trucks had driven off the face of the earth. Over the next few days, the Allies were too busy fighting the Germans to worry about a few missing trucks. But after the battle was over, the military launched a full investigation into what happened to the ghost convoy. They interviewed the surviving drivers and soldiers, and they searched the area where the convoy had stopped, but they couldn't find any evidence of what happened to the missing trucks. There were no signs of an attack, no German records of capturing American trucks in that area, and no reports of trucks being destroyed. The trucks had simply disappeared. Some people think that the missing trucks were ambushed by German forces and that the Germans covered up the attack by hiding the wreckage. But this theory doesn't make sense because the Germans were meticulous record keepers, and there's no mention of this ambush in any German military documents. Another theory is that the trucks took a wrong turn in the fog and drove off the road into a ravine or a river, but search teams combed the area and found nothing. Some people think the trucks were stolen by black market operators who were operating in the area during the war. There was a thriving black market for military supplies, and it's possible that someone saw an opportunity to steal a convoy of trucks full of valuable supplies. But if that's what happened, where did the trucks go? And how did the thieves manage to steal 15 trucks without anyone noticing? The most disturbing theory is that the trucks and their drivers were captured by a rogue German unit that was operating behind Allied lines, and that the drivers were executed and buried in a mass grave somewhere in the forest. But again, there's no evidence to support this theory. No bodies have ever been found, and no German soldiers ever came forward after the war to admit to being involved in such an incident. The ghost convoy of the Ardennes remains one of the strangest unsolved mysteries of World War II. 15 trucks and their drivers vanished without a trace in the middle of a battle, and no one has ever been able to figure out what happened to them. Some historians think that the records of what happened to the convoy were lost or destroyed during the chaos of the battle. Others think that the convoy was simply a victim of the fog of war, and that the trucks were destroyed or captured and no one bothered to document it. But the families of the missing drivers have never gotten closure, and the mystery of what happened that night in December 1944 has never been solved. To this day, people still search the Ardennes Forest looking for any sign of the missing trucks, but the forest has kept its secrets, and the ghost convoy remains a ghost. Number 2. U-530 and the Argentine connection. On July 10, 1945, more than 2 months after Germany surrendered, a German U-boat surfaced in the harbor of Mar del Plata, Argentina, and surrendered to Argentine authorities. The submarine was U-530, and its arrival in Argentina sparked one of the most enduring conspiracy theories of World War II. The commander of U-530 was Otto Wermuth, a 25-year-old officer who had been at sea when Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945. Instead of surrendering to Allied forces in Europe, Wermuth decided to sail to Argentina, a journey of more than 7,000 miles. When U-530 surfaced in Argentina, the crew was taken into custody and questioned by Argentine authorities and later by American intelligence officers. Wermuth claimed that he had sailed to Argentina because he didn't want to surrender to the Soviets, and he thought Argentina would be a safe place to go. But his story didn't add up. The journey from Europe to Argentina should have taken about a month, but U-530 didn't arrive until more than 2 months after Germany surrendered. So where was the submarine during those missing weeks? Wermuth claimed that he had been sailing slowly to conserve fuel, but investigators didn't believe him. They thought he had made a stop somewhere along the way, but Wermuth refused to say where. Another strange detail was that when U-530 surfaced in Argentina, the crew had thrown all of their documents and logbooks overboard. They also claimed that they had buried their Enigma machine at sea. This made it impossible for investigators to verify Wermuth's story or figure out where the submarine had been. But the story gets even stranger. Just a few weeks after U-530 surrendered, another German U-boat, U-977, surfaced in Argentina on August 17, 1945. The commander of U-977 was Heinz Schaefer, and like Wermuth, he claimed that he had sailed to Argentina to avoid surrendering to the Soviets. Schaefer's story was similar to Wermuth's, but it also had some inconsistencies. He claimed that he had been at sea for 66 days without stopping, but his crew looked healthy and well-fed when they surrendered. Investigators suspected that both submarines had made secret stops along the way, and the most popular theory is that they had stopped in Antarctica. There were rumors during and after the war that the Nazis had built a secret base in Antarctica called Base 211, or Neuschwabenland, and that high-ranking Nazi officials had fled there after Germany surrendered. Some people believe that U-530 and U-977 were part of a secret mission to transport Nazi officials' gold and stolen art to this secret base, and that they stopped there before continuing on to Argentina. But there's no concrete evidence that Base 211 ever existed. The Nazis did send an expedition to Antarctica in 1938 and 1939, but there's no evidence that they built a permanent base there. Another theory is that U-530 and U-977 were transporting high-ranking Nazi officials to South America to help them escape prosecution for war crimes. It's well documented that many Nazi war criminals fled to Argentina after the war, including Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele, and some people think that these submarines were part of an organized escape network. But again, there's no proof. Both Wermuth and Schaefer denied transporting any passengers, and when their submarines were searched, no evidence of passengers was found. The most disturbing theory is that one or both of these submarines were transporting Adolf Hitler himself to South America. There have been persistent rumors that Hitler didn't die in his bunker in Berlin in April 1945 and that he escaped to Argentina. Some people think that U-530 or U-977 picked up Hitler and Eva Braun from the coast of Germany and transported them to Argentina, where they lived out the rest of their lives in hiding. But this theory has been thoroughly debunked. DNA tests on skull fragments found in Hitler's bunker confirmed that Hitler died in Berlin, and there's no credible evidence that he ever made it to South America. So what were U-530 and U-977 really doing? The most likely explanation is that Wermuth and Schaefer were simply trying to avoid being captured by the Soviets, and they chose Argentina because it was a neutral country that had been sympathetic to Germany during the war. The missing weeks in their stories can probably be explained by the fact that they were traveling slowly and possibly hiding from Allied patrols. The fact that they destroyed their documents and logbooks is suspicious, but it's also possible that they did this to avoid giving the Allies any information about German naval operations. Both Wermuth and Schaefer were eventually released by Argentine authorities, and they lived out the rest of their lives in South America. Wermuth always maintained that he was just trying to survive, and that there was nothing sinister about his journey to Argentina. But the fact that 2 German submarines showed up in Argentina months after the war ended has fueled conspiracy theories for decades, and the truth about what they were really doing may never be fully known. Number 1. The village that hid Aribert Heim. In 1962, a German doctor named Aribert Heim walked out of his medical practice in Baden-Baden, Germany, and vanished. He left behind his wife, his 2 sons, and a comfortable life, but he had a very good reason to disappear. Aribert Heim was wanted for war crimes he had committed during World War II, and he knew that investigators were closing in on him. Heim had been a doctor at the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria in 1941, and during his time there, he had committed some of the most horrific acts of cruelty imaginable. Survivors of Mauthausen called him Dr. Death because of the sadistic experiments and murders he carried out. Heim would perform unnecessary surgeries on prisoners without anesthesia. He would remove organs from living patients to see how long they could survive. He would inject poison directly into the hearts of prisoners and time how long it took them to die. One survivor testified that Heim had decapitated a prisoner and boiled the skull so he could use it as a paperweight. Another survivor said that Heim would choose prisoners at random and operate on them just for practice. Heim only worked at Mauthausen for a few months, but in that time, he killed dozens of people, possibly more. After the war, Heim went back to practicing medicine, and he lived a normal life for nearly 2 decades. But in the 1960s, Nazi hunters started tracking down war criminals who had escaped justice, and Heim's name came up. When Heim realized he was being investigated, he fled Germany and disappeared. For the next 50 years, Aribert Heim was one of the most wanted Nazi war criminals in the world. He was on the Simon Wiesenthal Center's list of most wanted Nazis, and there was an international manhunt to find him. But despite decades of searching, no one could find him. There were reported sightings of Heim in South America, in Spain, and in North Africa, but none of them were confirmed. Some people thought he was dead. Others thought he was living under a false identity in some remote part of the world. But in 2009, the mystery of Aribert Heim was finally solved, sort of. German and Austrian investigators announced that they had evidence that Heim had died in Cairo, Egypt, in 1992. According to the investigation, Heim had fled to Egypt in the 1960s and had been living there under the name Tarek Hussein Farid. He had converted to Islam and had been working as a doctor in Cairo. He lived in a modest apartment and kept a low profile for nearly 30 years. The investigators said that Heim had died of intestinal cancer in 1992 and that he had been buried in an unmarked grave in Cairo. But here's where the story gets creepy and disturbing. The investigators also discovered that Heim had been helped by a network of people who knew exactly who he was and what he had done. One of the people who helped him was his own son, Rüdiger Heim, who had visited his father in Cairo multiple times over the years. Rüdiger admitted that he knew his father was a wanted war criminal, but he helped him anyway because he was his father. But Rüdiger wasn't the only one who helped Aribert Heim. The investigators discovered that Heim had been living in a neighborhood in Cairo where many German expatriates lived, and that several of them knew who he really was. They knew he was Dr. Death from Mauthausen, but they didn't turn him in. Some of them even helped him by giving him money and protecting his identity. The question that haunts investigators to this day is, why did these people help a man who had committed such horrific crimes? Some of them were old enough to remember World War II, and they would have known what Heim had done, so why did they protect him? One theory is that some of the people who helped Heim were Nazi sympathizers who believed in what he had done and wanted to protect him from justice. Another theory is that Heim had information or money that he used to buy their silence. He had been a wealthy man before he fled Germany, and it's possible that he paid people to keep quiet. But the most disturbing theory is that some of the people who helped Heim simply didn't care what he had done. They saw him as a fellow German living in a foreign country, and they felt a sense of loyalty to him, even though he was a monster. The investigators also discovered that Heim had kept a detailed diary during his time in Cairo, and in the diary he showed no remorse for what he had done at Mauthausen. He wrote about his daily life in Egypt, and he seemed to be living comfortably without any guilt or shame. When the investigators announced that Heim had died in 1992, many people were skeptical. Some Nazi hunters, including the Simon Wiesenthal Center, said they didn't believe Heim was dead. They thought the story about him dying in Cairo was a cover-up, and that he was still alive somewhere. The investigators provided documents, including a death certificate and testimony from people who knew Haim in Cairo, but some people still weren't convinced. They pointed out that the grave where Haim was supposedly buried was unmarked, and that no one had ever exhumed the body to confirm it was really him. To this day, there are people who believe that Aribert Haim faked his own death, and that he's still out there somewhere living under a new identity. But even if Haim really did die in 1992, the fact that he was able to live freely for 30 years, with the help of people who knew who he was, is deeply disturbing. It raises the question of how many other Nazi war criminals were able to escape justice with the help of sympathizers, and how many of them are still out there. The story of Aribert Haim is a reminder that even decades after World War II ended, the horrors of that war are still with us, and the people who committed those horrors were able to live normal lives while their victims never got justice. The village that hid Aribert Haim wasn't a village in the traditional sense. It was a community of people who chose to protect a monster, and that might be the creepiest part of all. Thanks for watching. If you found these mysteries as haunting as we did, we'd really appreciate it if you could give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more deep dives into history's darkest unsolved cases. We'll see you next time.